Chapter 7. The clouds were gloomy up in the evening sky, casting a drab shadow on the city below where Mary Jane Watson, once again, found herself on that same path to her Aunt Anna's apartment. Her stride was as fast as her thoughts, going a mile a minute. He hit her. Her father actually hit her. Mary Jane wiped hastily at her wet eyes with a swipe of her fingers, furious that she had resorted to tears. No. She was furious at her father for causing all of this by hitting her. As soon as she had gotten over the shock of the action that her father had inflicted, Mary Jane had immediately left the house. Her dad screamed at her, tried to get her to stop, but Mary Jane wouldn't allow herself to be deterred. In the end, he let her go. Probably realizing that she was better off without a deadbeat father like him. So, that was how she found herself on the streetcar, riding to Queens from Brooklyn before she got off and was walking the streets the rest of the way. She needed her Aunt Anna. The closest thing that she had to an actual mother while her real mother was not mother at all. Because at that moment, she needed to be comforted. To feel safe and protected. The sky above rumbled with rolling thunder, and yet, despite that, the streets were crowded for the early evening, which wasn't that uncommon for any of the city's boroughs. But Mary Jane hardly noticed as she walked dazedly forward, completely lost in her thoughts. That is, until the people surrounding her started to scream. Mary Jane looked up, startled, to see a crowd of people running away from the intersection just a dozen or so feet ahead of her. She stood frozen in her confusion as people bypassed her. Until one portly man clipped her on the shoulder as he tore past, knocking her over by the impact. She fell onto her back with a muted thud and a yelp that escaped from her chest, the fall resulting with a resounding ring to echo in her ears. The man did not stop to help her up, nor did he even ask if she was all right. He just continued to run. Mary Jane sat up so that her elbows were supporting the weight of her upper body, noting that she now had a few scrapes on her skin from where she landed on the hard pavement. Great. Just add that to the list of bodily harm she's had to endure tonight. When suddenly, a strange sound met her ears. It almost sounded like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But that wasn't quite right. She couldn't quite put a finger on why it sounded so familiar to her. Until she saw it. That was when it clicked in her mind. In the middle of the intersection ahead of her, the one that all of the people were in a desperate clamor to get away from, a large mound of fine sand sat. Oh, only it was growing. More sand was being pulled into the pile as though it was drawn to it. It reminded her of some sort of magnetic force. And watching the strange phenomenon was almost hypnotizing to witness as she stared in awestruck wonder. Frozen. So fascinating to her senses it was, that it was enough for her to contradict the action that the other citizens took with their instinct of flight by staying put. The pile of sand kept getting larger and larger until finally, it actually started to take shape. Forming into that of a man. Mary Jane gaped as the sand hardened, becoming more finite as the particles compressed together, transforming into something more defined. Until she was staring directly at the face of one of the escaped convicts she had seen on TV not even an hour before. Flint Marko. He was looking directly at her, from his viewpoint only a small distance away from her. And as soon as he caught sight of her bewildered expression, he smirked outright at her obviously mounting shock and fear as soon as she recognized who he was. Just what I needed. Marko mused, his grin growing wider as he stared her down. It was at that moment where she noticed a large burlap bag filled to the brim with cash clutched tight in his hand. A large gap opened up in Marko's chest, where he deposited the bag of money before sand filled the hole up again, the hostage. Mary Jane's eyes widened as a sharp gasp left her lungs. Flynn Marko started stalking in clomping steps toward her, malicious intent in his eyes. His hands rippled, starting to grow larger as more sand was transposed and added to his limbs, becoming twice the size of her body. This, for some reason, broke her out of her stupor as Mary Jane finally scrambled to her feet, already knowing that there was no plausible way she could get away in time. He was too close, and from what little she had seen from his powers, she knew that he would catch her the moment she turned to run. Still, she had to try. Mary Jane's body turned, right at the very same moment one of the large hands latched onto one of her slender legs. Mary Jane cried out as the action caused her body to fall forward from the momentum her legs had just been about to take. Her hands just barely managed to catch her fall as they pressed into the concrete of the sidewalk, keeping her from face planting. "Where do you think you're going, princess?" Marko called out to her with such vindictive glee in his voice. He was enjoying this. The sick bastard was actually enjoying this. Mary Jane was just about to open her mouth to scream, when... Funny, a taunting voice called out from above them, "I was about to ask you the same question, sourpuss." Mary Jane looked up just in time to see him mid-swing. She watched in amazement as he swung straight for Flint Marco before the heels of his boots landed a kick that collided perfectly with Marco's face. Marco's face exploded into a dust storm of sand. In the midst of the confusion, Marco released his hold on Mary Jane's leg. She fell completely to the ground with the lost support that was holding her up. "Spider-Man?" She heard Marco shout, rage pouring out of his voice. Mary Jane turned onto her back in order to better see what was going on. Her heart was thudding so soundly in her chest that it felt as though she just might pass out. Was it really Spider-Man? Her eyes followed Marco's indignant hate-filled gaze to spot where the figure that was perched on the wall of the closest building. It was Spider-Man. She couldn't believe that it was him. That she was in close proximity with him again. That he didn't disappear like the paranoid voice in the back of her mind pestered her to believe. Only, he wasn't wearing his normal suit. This suit he wore now looked haphazardly sewn together from a makeshift red hoodie. And for a moment, it confused her. It was then that she remembered the electric shock his normal suit had emitted the night she had found him unconscious in that alleyway. This suit must be his backup while his normal one was getting repaired. At the thought, despite the current situation she found herself in, she pictured a faceless Spider-Man sewing together straps of different fabric together to make this suit, and she had to laugh a little bit. Because she had to admit, the thought behind it was just so cute. "You're supposed to be dead." Flynn Marco screamed as he pointed an accusing finger at Spider-Man. Spider-Man quirked his head to the side, his bulky goggles narrowed slightly in confusion before he mockingly replied, "Dead? Me?" Spider-Man's hands left the building to travel all over the expanse of his own chest, derisively checking to see if his physical body was truly there, or if he was some sort of ghost instead. "Yeah," Flint cried out in rage, so shaken by it that he apparently had no filter. "Hammerhead said you got blown up by the big man's trap." Spider-Man froze. Mary Jane felt all the air in her lungs whoosh out of her. The explosion. It hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate. Someone, this big man, was trying to kill Spider-Man. Spider-Man got over his shock a lot faster than she did with her own, as he shook off the revelation as though it was nothing, bouncing right back into his sarcastic undertone. See, about that I have this theory that spiders can actually survive a nuclear explosion." "You ruined my life?" Marco screamed, his fist growing larger as it transformed into a giant hammer. "Or maybe that's just my spider bias talking." Spider-Man continued as though he hadn't heard Marco. Similar to a viper attack, Marco's hammer hand suddenly lurched forward, the sand extending his arm enough for it to reach where Spider-Man was currently perched on the wall. Mary Jane cried out in horror at the scene before her, knowing that she was about to witness Spider-Man get hit by solid sand that was going the speed of a freight train. But just when the hammer had been about to hit him, Spider-Man flipped off of the wall, narrowly missing what would have been a fatal blow. "Dude!" Spider-Man exclaimed, his voice stressed as he shot a web at the hammer mid-flip over Marco's head. "I don't even know who you are. How could I have possibly ruined your life?" When Spider-Man landed nimbly on his feet, he immediately pulled at the line of his webbing taut, forcing Marco back so that he landed with an audible thud on the pavement. As soon as he was on the ground, Spider-Man shot more webbing at Marco, trying to glue him to the asphalt with the sticky substance. "You did this to me. You signed my death sentence when you let me go to jail." Flynn Marco's body turned to tiny particles of sand, easily escaping through the gaps in the webbing. As soon as he was free, his body started to put itself back together again. The bag of money he had stashed in his chest stayed behind in its web prison. "And now you're going to pay." Marco's skin trembled before his arms started to transform in rippling waves, turning both of his hands into two giant clubs. With a giant cry of rage, his arms extended forward with bursts of sand. Slam! The two ends of the sledgehammer hands collided together just as Spider-Man dodged out of the way in an impressive flip. A sudden clap of thunder resounded from the clouds again, this time closer. "Arg!" Marco cried out in frustration as he continued swinging the clubs at his enemy, with Spider-Man dodging every attempted blow. "Why won't you just stay still?" Spider-Man flipped up in the air as he dodged another hit while simultaneously kicking Marco right in the face. Scattered sand went everywhere in a cloud of dust. Spider-Man landed nimbly on his feet. I'm shocked. I'm hurt. Spider-Man quipped in mock outrage. I thought that you liked it when we danced together? Marco's face morphed back to its original form before he turned to Spider-Man with the most hateful scowl. Would you just shut up? Spider-Man put a hand to his chest in mock horror. Now you're just being plain rude? Didn't your mom ever teach you manners? With a thunderous cry, Marco charged for Spider-Man like a rampaging rhino. But Spider-Man flipped out of the way once again. Well, since no one has taught you manners, I'll have to be the one to help you out. With that quip, Spider-Man shot a glob of webbing at Marco's face, covering the man's mouth in the sticky substance before he shot more webbing at his sandy limbs, trying to coat his entire body. Scattered droplets of rain started to fall. Once Marco was completely covered with globs of white, goopy webbing, Spider-Man stepped back and surveyed his handiwork by framing Marco's form with his hands. Now, I'm no photographer, but even I can tell an amazing work of art when I see one. The lighting. The angles. You almost resemble a newly reformed criminal? Spider-Man trailed off with a hopeful lilt in his tone. Marco's entire form trembled, shaking in his web prison, before he burst out in a storm of sand, exploding out of his web prison. His voice screamed out in rage that resounded in an echo all around. Spider-Man's goggled eyes widened in alarm as he staggered back. Whoops. Spoke too soon. He shot out a web line at the nearest building and swung out of the way just as the cloud of sand dumped on the spot he had been previously standing. But his swing wasn't fast enough. In a terrifying storm of loose, grainy particles, it redirected midair and slammed into Spider-Man, bringing him crashing down to the pavement. Spider-Man! Mary Jane cried out in horror. The pounding sand kept coming down on Spider-Man, holding him down against the asphalt by the continuous assault from the sandstorm when a hand formed out of the dust, wrapping around Spider-Man's neck. Marco's bodily form morphed from the rest of the sand as he grinned down vindictively at the hero pinned down by the throat underneath him. Now you're gonna pay. His arm transformed into a sharp, sandy axe. No. Mary Jane screamed as she broke out into a run toward them, needing to stop the horrific act before it could happen. Marco didn't pay her any mind as he brought his arm back in what was bound to be a powerful blow. Mary Jane didn't even think. She just acted on pure instinct alone. And before she even knew it, her purse was hurtling through the air toward Marco's head at the exact moment Spider-Man shot out a web. The purse hit Marco in the face just as Spider-Man's web stuck itself to Marco's axe hand. With Marco thoroughly distracted, Spider-Man pulled the line of webbing to the side with a mighty force, sticking the other end to the pavement, leaving enough of a gap for Spider-Man to escape through. As soon as he was free, Spider-Man rolled off to the side and onto his knees where he started coughing up a storm, trying his best to get a breath of fresh air. No doubt he had sand particles stuck in his throat from when the storm had been beating down on him. Mary Jane looked on at him in complete worry and fear, hoping beyond hope that he was all right. When a movement caught her eye, shifting her attention so that it was fully captured by it, Marco turned his enraged gaze onto her, his eyes ablaze with absolute fury. Mary Jane staggered back a step at the look of pure murderous rage. He pulled the axe free from its web confinement with a firm yank. You little bitch, Marco hissed before he got up onto firm feet and started stalking toward her. His face displayed such lethal intent that it caused Mary Jane's limbs to freeze on her in fear. Her mind was screaming at her to run, but her body wasn't able to comply. A deer caught in the headlights. His hands transformed into giant sledgehammers and Mary Jane knew, with just one swing of those powerful arms, she would be done for. I know. I'm the worst. But I'm already working on the next chapter, so I should be posting it soon. In the meantime, let me know what you think so far. Comments help to motivate me to write faster, winking face.